Ki Moon. Jeff, why don't we start with you, because you were down at these IMF meetings in Washington over the weekend. What didn't get done?
I think progress was made, actually. There was an agreement among the main finance ministers on the broad outlines of what should be done, protecting the banks, recapitalizing the banks, being upfront and forward in the crisis right now. In Europe, there was also an agreement taking core steps. More money has been put into bank capital in Europe this morning. I think it's starting to have an effect, at least, of probably putting a floor under the complete collapse. It's not going to turn around this crisis. It's not going to stop a recession in the U.S., but it could stop the collapse.
It would be nice to know if the basis of our economy is built on something other than pillars of salt or pillars of sand. Christian, this idea that the White House is talking about now, completely revamping the way it's going to approach the $700 billion bailout, not buy up these toxic securities, instead take an ownership stake in these banks, inject a lot of capital in there, recapitalize that industry. Is that a good idea?
I think it is. I mean, that's what Professor Sachs was talking about. I think that we've moved from this idea that it's just a crisis of liquidity, it's just a crisis of confidence, which is what the toxic debt buy-up was focused on, to the idea that there's a real serious problem with solvency in all the big banks around the world. And what we're seeing now, which I think is encouraging, is an emerging global consensus. And what we're going to be seeing, it looks like, is the big countries of the world going in, taking equity stakes. It's much cleaner. They're just injecting the capital directly. And also, it's fairer because the governments are going to end up owning stakes in these banks. What I think is important is that now that they're talking about this, they have to act quite quickly, because the fact that this plan is on the table means that private money that might have gone in the banks is really anxious. One of the things that will happen if the governments come in and take these equity stakes is existing equity holders will be diluted quite severely. So now is not a moment when you're waiting for this government plan to happen that you're willing to come in with your own $10 billion. And that's why we're seeing some issues with Morgan and Mitsubishi.
Yesterday, Jeff, I was watching the Sunday morning programs. Former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers was on, and he declared that this is worse than the crash of 1987, because it affects not just the stock market, it affects so many other things. Would you agree with that? And is this global coordination that you're talking about, or this idea of global coordination, enough to stop it, to turn it around?
I think in terms of the economic outcomes that are going to occur right now, a decline of housing construction, surely, big decline of consumption, a recession, a rise of unemployment, this will be a very, very significant shock. And so I think that it is the biggest of the financial crises. It clearly is affecting lots of other economies around the world. A lot has been said over the last few weeks about the complete collapse, the Great Depression. I think it's pretty clear that's not going to happen.
But as bad as 1987?
Well, remember, 87 was a sharp shock financially, but it didn't lead to a massive economic downturn. This one's going to have a bigger effect on the so-called real economy, the Main Street economy.
You have an article in today's Financial Times. You look at 4 consequences of the financial crisis. You say that America's very face of capitalism hangs in the balance. Will capitalism as we know it survive, Christian?
I think it will, but I do think that this crisis means that for ordinary Americans who have felt for such a long time that if you put your money in stocks, that you're going to see growth, and that will pay for your retirement, it will pay for your kids to go to college. This has really, really shaken people, and I think it's the moment when we saw the Dow crashing that suddenly this crisis became a reality for people on Main Street. So I think it's going to change people's relationship with the markets.
A lot of questions going forward. Christian Freeland, Jeff Sachs, it's always great to see you. Thanks for coming in today.
Thanks a lot.
Karen?
Well, it is 7:30 here in New York.